A racist chef refuses to cook for Barack Obama, humiliating a black aide in front of the entire staff. But what happened the next day turned everything upside down. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The evening sun spilled golden light through the stained glass windows of Rosemont Grill, casting soft patterns onto the polished mahogany floors. The air carried the faint aroma of rosemary and seared meat, a scent that had become synonymous with the restaurant's reputation for elegance and exclusivity. It wasn't just the menu that drew in the city's elite, it was the atmosphere, the sense of history and refinement carefully preserved in every detail, from the hand-carved chairs to the framed photographs of distinguished guests that lined the walls. In the center of it all stood Henry Barlow, the executive chef and undisputed ruler of the kitchen. His crisp white jacket, embroidered with his name in lupin gold thread, fit him like a coat of armor. His eyes scanned the dining room with the precision of a hawk, catching even the smallest imperfections. A crooked table setting, a fingerprint on a wine glass, a server moving too slowly. Nothing escaped his notice, and everyone knew it. Henry had built Rosemont Grill into what it was today. He'd inherited it from his father, a man whose old-world values had shaped both the restaurant and Henry himself. Tradition wasn't just a word to him, it was a law. The clientele reflected that, predominantly older, white, and wealthy. Over the years, he'd cultivated an environment where certain standards were expected, both in the kitchen and in the dining room. Those standards left no room for what Henry saw as modern trends, diversity hires, fusion cuisine, or social activism disguised as fine dining. The staff moved around him in controlled chaos, each one trained to operate like a cog in a well-oiled machine. The younger ones, especially, were careful not to cross him. Henry's temper was as famous as his risottos, and he had no patience for mistakes. Among them was Jamal Harrison, the lowest-ranking member of the kitchen team. Jamal kept his head down, scrubbing pots and prepping vegetables with practiced efficiency. He was young, only 23, but carried himself with a quiet determination that sometimes made the older staff uneasy. His presence in the kitchen was an anomaly. He was the only black employee in the restaurant, and everyone knew it. Jamal had learned to ignore the comments, the sideways glances, the jokes whispered just loud enough for him to hear. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to learn. The tattered notebook tucked in his apron pocket was filled with recipes his mother had taught him, dishes rooted in family history and tradition. Sometimes, on his lunch breaks, he'd sit in the alley behind the restaurant, flipping through the pages and dreaming about the restaurant he might own one day. But dreams felt far away in Rosemont Grill, especially under Henry's watchful eye. That night, as the dinner rush began, Henry moved through the kitchen, barking orders and tasting sauces. Jamal worked silently, dicing carrots into uniform cubes, when the owner of the restaurant, Robert Fields, appeared in the doorway. Robert was in his late 60s, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the chaos of the kitchen. The staff fell silent as he stepped inside. "Henry," Robert said, nodding toward the office. "A word." Henry wiped his hands on a towel and followed him, leaving the rest of the kitchen frozen in anticipation. Jamal exchanged a glance with Marcus, one of the line cooks, but neither spoke. Inside the office, Robert's voice was low but firm. Henry listened, arms crossed, his expression darkening with every word. When he emerged a few minutes later, his face was flushed and his jaw was tight. He clapped his hands sharply, snapping the staff back to work. "Focus," he snapped. "We're not running a cafeteria here." but the tension lingered, spreading through the kitchen like smoke. By the time service began winding down, the whispers had started. Marcus leaned toward Jamal as they scrubbed the counters. "You hear what that was about?" Marcus asked. Jamal shook his head, but the knot in his stomach told him it wasn't good. "The former president is coming," Marcus said. "Obama." Jamal froze, his hands tightening around the dish towel. "No way," he said, keeping his voice low. Marcus nodded. "Whole private party. Just confirmed it." Jamal's thoughts raced. Barack Obama, one of the most influential black men in history, was coming here? To Rosemont Grill? It felt surreal. For the first time in months, Jamal felt a flicker of excitement, as if maybe, just maybe, this could be his chance to prove himself. But when he looked at Henry, pacing near the prep station, his stomach sank. The look on the chef's face wasn't excitement. It was disgust. The following morning, Henry's mood hadn't improved. He summoned the entire staff before the lunch shift, his voice sharp as he addressed them. "We have a situation," he said. "Tomorrow night, we're hosting a private dinner for Barack Obama and his entourage." Murmurs rippled through the group. "I don't want any mistakes," Henry continued, his eyes locking on Jamal. "And let me make something clear. This is still my kitchen. We're doing things my way, no exceptions." Jamal clenched his jaw but said nothing. "Seating arrangements," Henry went on. "I want them in the back, away from the windows, away from the regulars. I don't care who he is. He's not going to disrupt the flow of this restaurant." The murmur turned into stunned silence. Even Marcus looked uneasy. "Problem?" Henry snapped. No one answered. "Good," he said. "Then let's get to work." The kitchen exploded into motion, but Jamal's mind wouldn't stop spinning. He thought about the notebook in his apron, about the recipes he'd written down, and about the stories his mother had told him. Stories of struggle and survival, of kitchens that were more than just places to cook food. For the first time since starting at Rosemont Grill, Jamal felt something stir inside him. He didn't know what it was yet. Anger, determination, hope, but it burned hot and steady. And as Henry barked orders and the staff scrambled to obey, Jamal made a silent promise to himself. Whatever happened tomorrow night, he wouldn't let it break him. The morning of the dinner arrived heavy with expectation, but inside the kitchen of Rosemont Grill, the air felt tighter than usual. The sharp clang of knives against cutting boards and the hiss of searing pans filled the space, yet it wasn't enough to drown out the underlying tension. Conversations were shorter, movements sharper. The staff had worked under pressure before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a dinner service, it was a test, and everyone knew it. Henry Barlow stood at the center of the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up and his hands planted firmly on the prep table. The early deliveries were already arriving. Crates of vegetables and spices lined up by the back door, but his eyes lingered on the clipboard in his hands. It detailed the menu for the evening, each course meticulously planned, yet Henry looked at it as though the paper itself offended him. "This is my kitchen," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the clatter. The staff froze, their eyes flickering toward him. "I don't care who's sitting out there tonight," he continued. "They eat what I cook, the way I cook it. No special requests, no exceptions." His gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Jamal, who stood at the far end of the counter, chopping parsley. Jamal didn't look up, but he felt the weight of Henry's stare, sharp as a knife. "And if anyone can't handle that," Henry added, his voice lowering, "you know where the door is." The message was clear. No one moved. Jamal's knife kept moving, each chop steady and precise, but his heart pounded in his chest. By noon, the tension had only grown thicker. Henry hovered near the pass, tasting sauces and inspecting plating with the intensity of a drill sergeant. Every mistake, too much salt, an uneven garnish, a smear on the rim of a plate, was met with a sharp rebuke. It didn't take long for his frustrations to zero in on Jamal. "Too slow," Henry barked as Jamal peeled carrots for one of the side dishes. "At this rate, we'll be here till midnight." Jamal swallowed the retort that burned in his throat and focused on his work. Henry stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "If you think tonight's some kind of opportunity, let me save you the trouble. You're not touching the main courses." Jamal froze, his fingers tightening around the peeler. "Stick to prep," Henry said, smirking. "You know, work you can't screw up." The words stung, but Jamal didn't let them show. Instead, he nodded and reached for another carrot. He'd heard worse before. But as the afternoon wore on, Henry's behavior grew more erratic. He sent back deliveries, claiming the produce wasn't up to standard, then berated the suppliers when they couldn't find replacements in time. He dumped a pot of soup down the drain, declaring it too thin, and ordered it remade from scratch. The staff scrambled to keep up, but it was clear Henry was deliberately creating chaos. In the break room, Marcus leaned against the wall, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's losing it," he muttered, looking at Jamal. Jamal didn't answer. Instead, he opened his notebook and flipped through the pages, his fingers pausing on a recipe his mother had taught him, a dish meant to bring people together. "You really think he's going to let this dinner happen?" Marcus asked. Jamal closed the notebook. "I think he's going to try to stop it." And he was right. By the time the dinner hour approached, Henry had taken things even further. He ordered the seating chart rearranged, placing Obama's table in the farthest corner of the dining room, away from the windows and out of sight. When the servers protested, he silenced them with a glare. "This is my restaurant," he snapped. "I decide where people sit." The tension spilled over into the kitchen. Henry began to micromanage every step of the process, tasting and retasting dishes, demanding changes that threw off the timing of the entire service. Jamal watched from his station, his frustration mounting. He'd spent weeks proving himself, enduring every insult and dismissal Henry had thrown his way, but this felt personal. And then it happened. Jamal was preparing the herb garnish for one of the dishes when Henry stormed over, grabbed the cutting board, and threw it into the trash. "Start over," he snapped. "And this time, try not to screw it up." Jamal froze, his hands clenched into fists. The rest of the kitchen fell silent. Even Marcus looked away, unwilling to meet Jamal's eyes. Henry leaned in closer. "You don't belong here," he said softly, "and no matter what happens tonight, you never will." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to fight back, to throw Henry's words in his face, but he didn't. Instead, he reached for another bunch of herbs and started chopping. The tension lingered, heavy and oppressive, but Jamal didn't let it break him. Not yet. As the final preparations began, the cracks in Henry's control widened. The kitchen staff, worn thin by his demands and outbursts, started making small acts of defiance, swapping ingredients without his approval, double-checking dishes he claimed were fine, and whispering encouragement to Jamal whenever Henry's back was turned. By the time the first guests arrived, the atmosphere in the kitchen was electric. The staff moved with a quiet determination, ignoring Henry's orders and focusing on getting the job done. And Jamal felt something shift inside him. For the first time since he'd started at Rosemont Grill, He wasn't just following orders. He was making a choice. And he knew it was only the beginning. The hum of conversation in the dining room grew louder as more guests filtered into Rosemont Grill. Candles flickered on polished tables, their light glinting off crystal glasses and silverware set with meticulous precision. The restaurant looked as it always had, refined, exclusive, a temple to tradition. But behind the kitchen doors, the pressure had reached a boiling point. Jamal stood at his station, his hands steady as he sliced herbs, but his mind raced. The tension from earlier still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. He could feel Henry's gaze burning into his back as the chef stalked through the kitchen, barking orders and slamming pans. The staff had grown quieter as the evening progressed, their usual banter replaced by the sharp clatter of knives and the hiss of steam. Everyone seemed to be walking on eggshells, afraid of setting Henry off again. Jamal glanced toward the dining room doors, where the murmurs of the guests seemed louder now. He knew who had arrived. He didn't need to see Barack Obama to feel the weight of his presence. The former president's arrival hadn't gone unnoticed. Some guests whispered behind raised menus, others openly turned their heads to look. But it was the staff's reaction that caught Jamal's attention. The quick glances toward the kitchen, the nervous shifting of weight, the tension in their shoulders. And then Henry emerged. He stepped into the dining room with the confidence of a man who believed he belonged there. His white chef's coat immaculate despite the chaos he'd left behind in the kitchen. His eyes swept over the tables until they landed on Obama's party, seated near the far end of the room, away from the windows as he'd planned. Jamal had expected Obama's group to stand out, but they didn't. They looked relaxed, talking and laughing quietly among themselves, their presence as natural as the flicker of the candles. But Henry didn't see it that way. The chef's expression hardened as he crossed the room, his steps deliberate. The chatter around the tables began to die down as heads turned to watch him. By the time he reached Obama's table, the restaurant had gone completely silent. Jamal couldn't hear what Henry said at first, but he saw the way Obama leaned back slightly, his face calm but watchful. The former president's body language was composed, but his eyes, sharp and unwavering, fixed on Henry like a challenge. And then Henry's voice rose. "This isn't that kind of restaurant," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The words landed like a slap. Jamal's knife slipped, nicking his finger, but he barely noticed. Obama didn't flinch. He said something in reply, too quiet for Jamal to hear, but whatever it was, it only made Henry angrier. "You don't get special treatment here," Henry snapped, his voice echoing through the room. "You and your group can take your seats where I've placed you, or you can leave." Gasps rippled through the dining room. Some guests exchanged nervous glances, others pulled out their phones. Servers froze mid-step, unsure whether to intervene or wait for orders. Obama's party shifted, some of them visibly uncomfortable, but he remained still. Jamal felt his breath catch as he saw the change in Obama's posture, a slight lean forward, the set of his jaw. He wasn't angry, he was focused. Whatever he said next, it was deliberate, controlled, but Henry wasn't listening. "You think you can walk in here and demand whatever you want?" Henry's voice shook with barely contained rage. "Not in my restaurant, not tonight." And then it happened. Henry reached across the table, grabbing the plate of appetizers that had just been served, and dumped it onto the floor. The dining room erupted into chaos. Servers rushed to clean up the mess, guests began murmuring loudly, and several stood up, clearly uncomfortable with what they'd just witnessed. Phones were raised, cameras clicking and recording. In the kitchen, The staff froze. Jamal's heart pounded as he looked at Marcus, who stared back at him with wide eyes. "We have to do something," Marcus whispered. Jamal didn't hesitate. He pulled off his apron and strode toward the dining room doors, his footsteps steady even as his stomach twisted in knots. Henry was still standing by Obama's table, his chest heaving as he glared down at the former president. Jamal stepped forward. The room fell silent again. "Chef," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his throat. Henry turned, his eyes narrowing. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped. Jamal didn't back down. "I'm serving the guests," he said. For a moment, no one moved. Then Henry stepped closer, his face twisted in anger. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Get back to the kitchen." Jamal shook his head. "No." Henry's face went red. "You're done," he hissed. "You're fired." Jamal didn't flinch. "I don't care." And then he turned to Obama. "Sir, I'd be honored to prepare your meal." The former president's expression softened, and he nodded. Henry lunged forward, but before he could say anything, Marcus and 2 other staff members stepped between him and Jamal. "Leave," Marcus said. Henry froze. "What did you just say?" "You heard him," another server said. "Get out." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. And then, slowly, Henry turned and walked out. The room erupted into whispers, but Jamal didn't stop to listen. He turned back to Obama's table and nodded. "I'll make sure it's perfect," he said. And then he disappeared into the kitchen, the staff falling in behind him. Jamal's hands shook as he tied his apron back on, but his focus didn't waver. He grabbed the notebook from his pocket, flipping it open to the recipe his mother had taught him, the one he'd dreamed of serving in a place like this. Tonight, he thought, it wasn't about proving himself to Henry or anyone else. It was about honoring the people who had come before him. And he wasn't going to fail. The kitchen door swung shut behind Jamal, muffling the hum of conversation and the distant clicks of cameras from the dining room. He exhaled sharply, gripping the edges of the stainless steel counter to steady himself. His heart was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins, but his hands didn't shake. Not now. Not when the entire night rested on what happened next. The rest of the kitchen staff stood frozen, their eyes flicking between Jamal and the swinging door that Henry had stormed through just moments earlier. The tension that had hung over the room all day now cracked like thunder, leaving an unsettling quiet in its wake. Marcus was the first to speak. "What the hell just happened?" His voice was low, but the words carried the weight of the moment. Jamal straightened, forcing himself to meet the gazes of the others. "We don't have time to talk about it," he said. "We need to focus." "But Henry," one of the prep cooks started. "He's gone," Jamal cut in, "and he's not coming back." That truth hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Henry's name had been synonymous with this kitchen for years, and his absence felt like a void opening under their feet. But Jamal didn't let himself think about it. "Listen," he said, his voice firmer now. "I know what this looks like, but we can still do this. We've prepped everything we need. The only thing left is to execute." No one moved. Jamal swallowed, knowing what they were all thinking. He wasn't Henry. He wasn't even the sous chef. He was the lowest-ranking person in the kitchen, a line cook who'd never been given the chance to prove himself. But tonight, he wasn't asking for permission. He reached for the clipboard Henry had thrown down earlier and slapped it onto the counter. "This is the menu," he said. "It's good, but it's not perfect." Henry didn't care about making it right. He cared about making a point. We're not doing that. Marcus stepped forward, eyeing Jamal carefully. And what are we doing? Jamal pulled the tattered notebook from his apron pocket and set it next to the clipboard. We're making this. The others leaned in, their eyes scanning the handwritten recipes. Some of the pages were stained, the ink smudged from years of use, but the notes in the margins were clear. Adjustments to seasoning, reminders about cooking times, and the names of the family members who had inspired each dish. You're serious? Marcus asked. Completely. A beat of silence passed, then Marcus nodded. Okay, he said, let's do it. The others hesitated, but one by one they stepped forward. It wasn't a vote of confidence, more like an act of desperation. But Jamal would take it. He flipped to the first recipe and started assigning tasks. Marcus, you're on vegetables. Sandra, I need you on sauces. Everyone else, stay on prep until we're ready to plate. They moved, slowly at first, then faster as the rhythm of the kitchen returned. Knives chopped, pans sizzled, and the tension began to lift. Jamal worked alongside them, his hands steady as he measured out spices and mixed marinades. He didn't think about Henry, or the cameras in the dining room, or the fact that one mistake could ruin everything. He thought about the smell of his mother's kitchen, the sound of her humming as she cooked, and the way her food had always brought people together, no matter who they were or where they came from. But the peace didn't last. An hour into service, the back door banged open and Henry stormed in. He was still wearing his chef's coat, though it was rumpled now and his face was flushed. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared. The kitchen froze. Jamal stepped forward, planting himself between Henry and the others. "We're finishing the service," he said. Henry's eyes narrowed. "Not with my recipes, you're not." "They're not your recipes," Jamal shot back. "Not anymore." Henry's face reddened further, and for a moment Jamal thought he might throw a punch. But instead, Henry's lips twisted into a sneer. "You really think you can pull this off?" he said. "You, a prep cook?" Jamal didn't flinch. "Yes." The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Henry lunged towards the prep table, grabbing a pan and knocking it to the floor. The sound echoed through the kitchen, but no one moved. Jamal stood his ground. "Get out," he said. Henry froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Jamal said. "Get out." Behind him, Marcus stepped closer. "He's right," Marcus said. "You need to go." Sandra joined him. "We don't work for you anymore." One by one, the rest of the staff stepped forward. Henry's gaze swept over them, his face contorted with rage, but there was nowhere for him to go. The staff had turned against him. He slammed his fist against the counter, then spun on his heel and stormed out. The door swung shut behind him, and the kitchen erupted into motion again. Jamal took a shaky breath, but there was no time to dwell on what had just happened. "Marcus, check the vegetables," he said. "Sandra, how's the sauce?" They snapped back to work, the rhythm of the kitchen returning as if Henry had never been there. By the time the first plates went out, Jamal felt a shift in the air. The staff wasn't just working, they were creating. And when the servers returned with empty plates and compliments from the dining room, Jamal finally allowed himself to smile. They weren't just finishing the service. They were changing everything. The hum of the kitchen had steadied into a rhythm that felt almost natural, but the echoes of Henry's outburst lingered like smoke in the air. Plates clinked as servers rushed in and out, their trays balanced high and their steps purposeful. Yet every time the door swung open, Jamal half expected Henry to come storming back in, eyes blazing and fists clenched. but he didn't. Henry was gone, and with each passing minute, that fact began to sink in, not just for Jamal, but for everyone. The tension that had dominated the room all evening began to loosen. Marcus cracked a quiet joke about the carrots, and Sandra actually laughed, her voice sharp and sudden in the stillness. Even Jamal felt his shoulders drop as the final dishes for Obama's table were plated and sent out. Yet, his relief was short-lived. It started with the servers. Jamal noticed their hesitation as they returned from the dining room, their eyes darting toward the kitchen before quickly looking away. One by one, they leaned in to whisper something to Sandra or Marcus, who then glanced nervously at Jamal. Finally, Marcus pulled him aside. "You need to see this," he said, nodding toward the back entrance. Jamal wiped his hands on his apron and followed him out the door, stepping into the cool night air. The alley behind the restaurant was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, but Jamal didn't need light to see what was happening. A crowd had gathered in front of the building. Protesters, cameras, reporters. Signs waved above their heads, some in support of equality, others scrawled with insults and slurs. And there, in the center of it all, stood Henry. He wasn't wearing his chef's coat anymore. Instead, he changed into a suit, the tie hanging loosely around his neck. He held a microphone, speaking into the cameras with the same authority he'd wielded in the kitchen. "This is what happens when we give in to political correctness," Henry shouted, his voice amplified by the speakers someone had set up. "They come in and take over. Our jobs, our businesses, our way of life." Jamal's stomach dropped. Henry wasn't just trying to save face. He was trying to burn the entire restaurant down with him. The crowd responded, a mix of cheers and jeers. Some raised their fists in agreement. Others yelled back, accusing Henry of racism and bigotry. "Is this what we've come to?" Henry continued, his voice trembling with rage, caving to pressure, letting a prep cook, take over the kitchen I built with my own hands. Marcus shifted uneasily beside Jamal. "This is bad," he said. Jamal's fist tightened at his sides. "We can't let this stop us," he said. "Not now." He turned back towards the door, but before he could step inside, one of the reporters spotted him. "There he is!" The cameras swung toward Jamal. Lights flashed. Questions flew at him, sharp and rapid. "Jamal, how does it feel to steal Henry Barlow's kitchen? Do you think you deserve to be in charge? Was this planned? A political stunt?" Jamal froze. For a moment, all he could see were the lenses pointed at him, the microphones shoved in his direction. But then he remembered the dining room, the guests waiting for their meals, the staff counting on him to hold things together. He didn't owe the reporters an explanation. Without a word, he turned and stepped back inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. The noise outside faded, but his pulse didn't slow. Sandra was waiting for him at the pass. "They're asking questions," she said. "People are taking sides. Half the comments online are calling you a hero, and the other half—" "I know," Jamal interrupted, "but we're not done yet. We finished the service." The staff nodded, and the kitchen roared back to life. By the time the final dishes were plated and sent out, Jamal felt the weight of exhaustion settling over him. But there was no time to rest. The dining room was emptying, and the aftermath of the evening was already beginning to unfold. Robert Fields, the owner of the restaurant, appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Jamal, my office, now." The rest of the staff avoided his gaze as Jamal followed Robert through the hall and into the small windowless room that smelled faintly of old leather and whiskey. Robert didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. "I've been on the phone with our lawyers," he said, "and with the board." Jamal's heart sank. "We're letting Henry go." Jamal blinked. "What?" Robert's eyes softened. "You did good tonight," he said. "Better than I expected. But this isn't over." Jamal's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "Henry's already talking to the press. The story's out there now and people are watching. Some of them are already canceling reservations. Others are calling in support. It's a mess." "So, what do we do?" Robert finally met his eyes. "We rebuild, but I need someone who can lead this kitchen through it." Jamal froze. "You're offering me the job?" "I'm offering you a chance," Robert said, "to prove that tonight wasn't just a fluke. But it won't be easy. People are going to question you. Some of them won't give you a fair shot. And Henry, he's not going away quietly." Jamal's mind raced. The weight of the night, the fight with Henry, the cameras and questions, it all pressed down on him. But then he thought about the food they'd served, the way the staff had rallied behind him, the way Obama had looked at him, not as a line cook, but as a chef. He nodded. "I'll do it." Robert extended his hand and Jamal shook it. Outside, the cameras were still flashing, and Henry's voice still echoed through the night. But inside the kitchen, Jamal's team was waiting, and for the first time, it felt like his kitchen. The kitchen was quiet now. The clang of pots and sizzle of pans had died down, leaving only the faint hum of the ventilation system and the occasional shuffle of footsteps as the staff cleaned up. Jamal stood at the prep station, his hands resting on the edge of the counter. The stainless steel felt cold beneath his fingertips, but it grounded him, kept him focused. Henry was gone. That truth hung in the air, heavier than the smell of roasted garlic still lingering from the night service. Jamal's reflection stared back at him from the polished surface of the prep table, tired, sweaty, but resolute. He'd done it, but the victory felt fragile, like a souffle that could collapse at any moment. Outside, the crowd hadn't dispersed. Protesters and reporters still lingered, their chants and shouts barely muffled by the walls. The media frenzy showed no signs of slowing down, and Jamal knew the night was far from over. He looked up as Marcus entered the kitchen, carrying a stack of dirty dishes. "They're still out there," Marcus said, setting the plates down with a loud clatter. "And Henry's not helping." Jamal didn't need to ask what he meant. Henry had been out there for hours, fueling the fire with speeches and interviews. The crowd outside wasn't just angry, they were divided. Some carried signs supporting Henry, calling for boycotts and demanding his reinstatement. Others held banners that read, "Equality over ego," and "Food has no color." Marcus leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked. "This isn't just about the food anymore. It's bigger than that." Jamal wiped his hands on his apron, the tension settling deeper into his chest. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we keep going. We clean up, we prep for tomorrow, and we make sure every plate that leaves this kitchen is perfect." Sandra appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Robert wants to see you in the office," she said quietly. Jamal's stomach sank. He nodded, untied his apron, and followed her through the narrow hallway to the small, dimly lit office at the back of the restaurant. Robert was already there, seated behind his desk with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He gestured for Jamal to sit, but Jamal remained standing. "Relax," Robert said, swirling the glass in his hand. "You earned it." Jamal didn't feel relaxed. He felt like the ground beneath him was still shifting, and one wrong step could send everything crashing down. "You did good tonight," Robert continued, Better than anyone expected. Jamal swallowed hard. Thank you. But, Robert added, setting the glass down with a sharp clink, this isn't over. Henry's out there stirring up trouble and the press is eating it up. Half the city thinks you're a hero, and the other half thinks you're a thief who took something that wasn't yours. Jamal's hands clenched into fists at his sides. I didn't take anything, he said. Henry gave it up the second he decided his ego was more important than the food. Robert raised an eyebrow, but there was no judgment in his expression. I know that, he said, and the people who ate here tonight know it too. But the rest of the world? He shook his head. They don't care about the truth. They care about the story. Jamal exhaled slowly. So what do we do? Robert leaned back in his chair. We rebuild, he said. But that means making some changes, starting with you. Jamal blinked. What about me? I need a new head chef, Robert said simply, and I want it to be you. The words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. You can't be serious, he said. I've never been more serious. But I'm just... A prep cook? Robert interrupted. Not anymore. Jamal shook his head. There are better people for this job, more experienced people. Robert leaned forward. I don't need experience, he said. I need someone who can lead, someone who knows what this restaurant is about and isn't afraid to fight for it. You proved tonight that you're that person. Jamal didn't know what to say. He thought about the kitchen, about the way the staff had rallied behind him when Henry lost control. He thought about the plates that had gone out, dishes inspired by his family's recipes, by his mother's love of food and tradition. And he thought about the crowd outside, the chants, the protests, the cameras. People are going to hate this, he said quietly. Robert didn't flinch. Then let them hate it, he said. This restaurant isn't about politics, it's about food. And tonight, you reminded everyone why that matters. Jamal swallowed hard. What if I fail? Robert smiled. Then you fail, he said, and then you try again. Jamal exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. Okay, he said finally. I'll do it. Robert stood and extended his hand. Good, he said. Now go tell your team. Jamal stepped back into the kitchen, his mind still racing. The staff looked up as he entered, their eyes filled with questions. Well? Marcus asked. Jamal took a deep breath. I'm the new head chef, he said. The room erupted into cheers. Marcus clapped him on the back, and Sandra grinned as she wiped her hands on a towel. But even as they celebrated, Jamal couldn't shake the weight of what lay ahead. Henry wasn't gone. He was out there, fanning the flames and turning public opinion against them. And Jamal knew it was only a matter of time before the backlash hit harder. But for now, he focused on the people in front of him, the team that had stood by him when it mattered most. Let's get ready for tomorrow, he said. Because tomorrow wasn't just another service. It was the beginning of something new. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Rosemont Grill, casting long shadows over the empty dining room. Jamal stood near the host's podium, staring at the neatly arranged tables. They looked the same as they always had. White linen tablecloths, polished silverware, folded napkins shaped like lilies. But today, everything felt different. Yesterday, this room had been the stage for a battle. Now, it was a battlefield left in eerie silence, the echoes of raised voices and shattered norms lingering like ghosts in the corners. Jamal had barely slept. After Robert officially offered him the position of head chef, the weight of the responsibility had settled heavily on his shoulders. He had spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, going over the inventory, rewriting prep lists, and planning changes to the menu. But even as he tried to focus on the food, his thoughts kept drifting to the crowd outside. When he left the restaurant the night before, the protesters were still there. Henry's voice had faded, drowned out by chants and debates between the opposing groups, but the tension had remained thick. Jamal had felt it pressing against his chest as he walked past the signs and the cameras, as if the weight of their anger and expectations might crush him before he even made it home. Now, standing in the empty dining room, he could still feel it. The sound of the kitchen door swinging open snapped him back to reality. Marcus appeared, carrying a clipboard and looking surprisingly awake for someone who had stayed until midnight cleaning up. "Mornin', Chef," he said, grinning. Jamal blinked at the word. Chef. He still wasn't used to it. "Mornin'," he replied, forcing a smile. "How's the prep going?" "On schedule," Marcus said, handing him the clipboard. "Veggies are prepped, sauces are simmering, and Sandra's working on desserts." Jamal scanned the notes, nodding absently. "Any sign of—" "Still out there," Marcus interrupted, reading his mind. "Reporters, protesters, the whole circus. We had a couple of reservation cancellations already, but we've also had people calling to book tables, people who want to support you." Jamal set the clipboard down, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not about me," he said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Could have fooled me," he said. "You're all over the news, man. Social media's blowing up. Half the comments are calling you the future of fine dining, and the other half, well, let's just say they're not as flattering." Jamal frowned. "What about Henry?" Marcus's expression darkened. "He's still talking," he said. "Some radio station had him on this morning. He's spinning the whole thing, calling it a coup, saying you and Robert planned it to push him out." Jamal's jaw tightened. "And people believe him?" "Some," Marcus admitted, "but not all. A lot of folks are saying what happened was a long time coming." Jamal exhaled slowly, trying to push the frustration away. "Doesn't matter," he said. "We focus on the food." Marcus nodded and disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving Jamal alone with his thoughts. The lunch service started slowly. The first few guests were regulars, older couples who had been dining at Rosemont Grill for years and were clearly unsure about what to expect. Jamal stayed in the kitchen, tasting sauces and double-checking plates before they went out, but he couldn't ignore the nervous energy radiating from the servers as they carried the dishes to the tables. By mid-afternoon, the crowd began to change. Younger diners arrived, some of them openly recording videos and snapping photos for social media. One group even asked for a picture with Jamal when he stepped out to check on a table. Not everyone was so supportive. A man in a dark suit approached the host stand just before the dinner rush, his face red and his voice sharp as he demanded to speak to the manager. "I've been coming here for years," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "and I won't sit in a restaurant run by someone who disrespects tradition." Jamal stepped forward before the host could respond. "We're not disrespecting tradition," he said calmly. "We're honoring it in a new way." The man's eyes narrowed. "You think this is progress?" he sneered, "turning a fine dining establishment into a political statement?" Jamal didn't flinch. "I think food should bring people together," he said, "not push them apart." The man stared at him for a long moment before turning and walking out. The incident left a ripple of tension in its wake, but Jamal refused to let it break his focus. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of orders and plates, but as the last guests filtered out and the staff began cleaning up, Jamal knew the hardest part was still ahead. Because no matter how well the night had gone, the controversy wasn't fading. When he stepped outside after locking up, the crowd had thinned, but the cameras were still there. Reporters called his name, flashing lights blinding him as microphones were shoved toward his face. "Jamal, do you think Henry was right? Was this about race? Are you planning to change the menu permanently?" Jamal kept walking. He didn't stop until he reached his car, where he leaned against the door and let out a long breath. He thought about his mother's recipes, about the way her food had always felt like an act of defiance and love rolled into one. And he thought about Henry, about the anger in his voice, the bitterness in his words. Jamal didn't hate him. He pitied him. Because Henry had spent his whole life building walls, and now he was trapped inside them, while Jamal had finally stepped through to the other side. Tomorrow there would be more questions, more protests, more pressure, but Jamal would be ready. Because for the first time, this kitchen, this restaurant, felt like it truly belonged to him. The next morning, Jamal arrived at Rosemont Grill before sunrise. The street outside was quieter than it had been the night before, but traces of the chaos lingered. Discarded protest signs, trampled flyers, and the faint outlines of chalk slogans that had been hastily scrubbed from the sidewalk. Jamal stepped over the remnants as he unlocked the door, pushing past the weight of uncertainty that seemed to hang in the air. Inside, the restaurant felt almost peaceful, the faint smell of lemon cleaner mixing with the lingering aromas of garlic and roasted meat. But the peace was fragile, and Jamal knew it wouldn't last. Today was about more than food. It was about proving that Rosemont Grill wasn't defined by one man's anger or by the headlines that had turned it into a battleground. It was about proving that this place, this kitchen, could be something more. He took a deep breath and stepped into the kitchen, where Marcus and Sandra were already at work. "Morning, Chef," Marcus said, looking up from a cutting board piled with carrots. "Morning," Jamal replied, tying on his apron. The word still felt foreign, but less so than it had the day before. Sandra set down a whisk and nodded toward the prep station. "You ready for this?" she asked. Jamal didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said. "Let's do it." The morning prep went smoothly, but the tension returned as the lunch hour approached. The first guests arrived early. Some familiar faces, others clearly there out of curiosity. Jamal could feel their eyes on him every time he stepped into the dining room, scanning him like he was part of the decor they were evaluating. The servers handled it well, but Jamal could sense their nerves. The staff knew what was at stake, and then the protest started again. It began with chanting outside, muffled at first, then growing louder. Jamal recognized some of the voices from the night before, but there were new ones too. He tried to block it out, focusing on the food, but the noise seeped into the kitchen like smoke. Marcus appeared at his side, looking uneasy. "They're getting louder," he said, "and Henry's back." Jamal froze, his knife hovering over a cutting board. "He's outside?" Marcus nodded. "With reporters, and a new sign that says Save Our Restaurant." Jamal felt his pulse quicken. "He's not going to stop," Marcus added. Jamal set the knife down carefully. "Then neither will we," he said. But the weight of Henry's presence pressed down on him all afternoon. Even as the orders kept coming and the staff fell into a rhythm, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. By the time dinner service began, the tension had reached a breaking point. Jamal was plating the final course for one of the larger tables when the door swung open and a hush fell over the dining room. It wasn't Henry. It was Barack Obama. Jamal's hands froze. The room seemed to tilt for a moment as the former president entered, smiling warmly but carrying himself with the quiet authority that had defined his years in office. The servers scrambled to greet him, leading him and his guests to a table near the center of the room, the same table Henry had tried to banish him from just 2 nights earlier. Jamal exhaled slowly. This was it. He wiped his hands on a towel, straightened his apron, and stepped out of the kitchen. The dining room was silent as he approached Obama's table, but the former president rose to his feet before Jamal could speak. "Jamal," he said, extending his hand. Jamal shook it, his palms damp despite his efforts to stay calm. "Mr. President," he said quietly. "Call me Barack," Obama replied, smiling, "and call me impressed." Jamal blinked. "I've been hearing about what you've done here," Obama continued, his voice carrying just enough weight to remind everyone in the room who he was. "And I wanted to see it for myself." Jamal nodded, his throat dry. "We're honored to have you here," he said finally. "The honor's mine," Obama said. Jamal excused himself and returned to the kitchen, but the noise from the dining room didn't fade this time. It grew louder, buzzing with whispers and speculation. Sandra stepped closer. "You okay?" she asked. Jamal nodded, but his hands trembled slightly as he picked up a ladle. The first course went out flawlessly. Seared scallops with citrus glaze, garnished with microgreens. Jamal watched from the kitchen door as Obama took his first bite, smiling as he leaned back in his chair. But it wasn't until the main course that Jamal let himself breathe. The dish was his mother's recipe, a braised short rib with collard greens and cornbread. It was simple, soulful, and unapologetically different from anything Rosemont Grill had served before. He held his breath as the plates were delivered. Obama took one bite, then another, and then he looked up, catching Jamal's eye through the kitchen door. He nodded. And just like that, the tension broke. The dining room erupted into applause, and Jamal felt the knot in his chest loosen. For the rest of the night, the kitchen hummed with energy. Plates flew out faster than ever, and the staff moved with a confidence that hadn't been there the day before. When the final dessert was served, Jamal stepped back into the dining room where Obama was waiting. "That," Obama said, shaking his hand again, "was incredible." "Thank you," Jamal replied, his voice steady this time. "You've got something special here," Obama said. "Don't lose it." Jamal promised he wouldn't. When Obama left, the staff gathered in the kitchen, exhausted but triumphant. Jamal looked around at the faces, Marcus, Sandra, the servers, and felt something shift. This wasn't Henry's kitchen anymore. It was theirs. And as he hung up his apron for the night, Jamal knew the real work was just beginning. Because food wasn't just about feeding people. It was about breaking down walls, building bridges, and leaving behind something that mattered. And for the first time, Jamal felt ready. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Watch our other stories and share this video with your friends. We value your opinions in the comments. Where are you watching us from?